The Diary of Anne Frank, the play, resonates with me very, very much because I was a teenager, just like these kids at the time. In 1942, Anne Frank was 13, her boyfriend was 16, her sister was 16, and I was 15. And we pretty well, all young people during that time went through the sort of the same similar steps. We were born in one country, then with Hitler's arrival we moved to another country, and Hitler caught up with us, and then we were dragged through the camps, and few of us, very few of us survived. The majority died. And when we were liberated from the camps, all of us were orphans, and we had to start from scratch. We had to find food, we had to find living. We never were really teenagers. I didn't have a girlfriend until I was about 23 years old. I had my first girlfriend then, and I married her, and I was married to her for 61 years, until she unfortunately passed on. Don't clap. I'm at the stage where if you clap too loud, I'll fall over. You don't want to see that. So, I'd like to talk a little bit about myself, and at the same time draw parallels with Anne Frank. In 1933, when Hitler came to power, he immediately instituted a whole series of laws, some of them affecting Catholics, some of them affecting Jews. And in the third month, 2 months after Hitler came to power, there was a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses. Then Jews were banned from civil service jobs, universities, teaching, and many major corporations. Jews were barred, and laws against overcrowding of schools stops Jews from going to school. In plain English, Hitler deprived Jews of their livelihood and their education. And in 1933, my father, mother, sister, and myself left Germany, and we went to Yugoslavia, and that's a picture of me and my sister in 1933. I used to be adorable. And we moved to a beautiful town and immediately ran into problems because, number one, the country didn't need any engineers. My father was a mechanical and an electrical engineer. And secondly, we had to learn Croat and Serbian, and my parents never managed it. In 1933, the Frank family left Germany and they went to Holland. And there they ran into similar problems, only they had to learn Dutch. And by the way, the Diary of Anne Frank was written in Dutch. Even everybody in that room was born in Germany, including the Van Pels family. Peter Van Pels, he was born in Germany. And Mr. Frank hired a young Austrian woman, Miep Gies, to take care of his office work. She was an Austrian woman who had been adopted by a Dutch family. And that's a picture of me when I was about 11 years old. And we lived a fairly happy life in Yugoslavia and occasionally went down to the beaches, and Anne Frank did exactly the same thing during that period of time. She enjoyed going to the beach, and there's Anne lying on the floor and her sister Margaret. And then in May 1940, Germany attacked Holland, and about a year later, Germany kept occupying more and more of Europe and attacked Yugoslavia. And the part where I lived, Croatia, came under the ruling of Dr. Ante Pavelic. And he immediately opened a concentration camp called Jasenovac that killed about 200,000 people. Only 20,000 of them were Jewish, the others were all Serbian or Muslims. And most of them were killed by having their throats cut with knives like this. In one town in Kragujevac, a couple of German soldiers were shot, so they went to a local high school, they arrested 200 students, and they shot them. In Glina, they brought all the men into a Serbian Orthodox church, and they lined them all up, and they took this beautiful picture. And then 2 minutes later, they were all shot. We had to wear a yellow star. And we wore this yellow star on the front and also on the back. And Anne Frank had to wear a yellow star only with the letter, there was the word Jod on it. When you walked on the street and there were German soldiers on the sidewalk, you had to step into the gutter. You couldn't walk on the sidewalk. I stopped going to school about 2 weeks after the German invasion, after the war ended. My mother was afraid that something would happen to me, so in roughly June 1941, she placed me with a couple who worked for the resistance movement. And they were developing films and making enlargements, and I was doing all that work for about 2 years. And it was on June 12, 1942, a year later, that Anne, on her birthday, got this diary on her 13th birthday. And then on July 1942, which was much later, they were hidden in the secret annex in this house in Amsterdam. And the woman who kept feeding them, who kept providing the food, was Miep Gies. She was the one who really did all the heavy work, and she was the one who had great difficulty providing food. In May 1943, after I'd been hiding from 41 to 43, Gestapo agents found the place where I was, and I was arrested by the Gestapo and questioned and beaten up, and I was bleeding and crying, and I was at that time 15 years old. And from there I was taken to a border town between Croatia and Slovenia, and I was locked up in a tiny little cell which must have been a drunk tank, because it was filled with fleas. And I was wearing short-sleeved shirt and short pants, and it was just plain hell. And from there I was moved to Graz, Austria, and I found myself in this building, which still today is the police headquarters in Graz. I was locked up in a little cell in the back of the building with 3 other kids. 2 kids had been arrested for burglary, and one of the kids had murdered his mother. And I was the 4th criminal there. By the way, they were not Jewish. And I was there for 6 weeks, and one day I looked out of the window into the police station yard, and I saw my mother walking around. and that's the last time I saw her. From there, I was shipped to Vienna, and I spent the night in this absolutely gorgeous synagogue in Vienna, except by the time I came there, it didn't look like this anymore, it looked like this. It was vandalized during the night of the broken glass. There was soot and dirt and broken glass and water. It was a real mess. And there were about 120 other people there. And I had really difficulty finding a place where to sleep because the seats were all torn up and there was all this glass on the floor. And the next day we went on a 2-day train ride and we ended up in Czechoslovakia in a place called Terezín. And if you look at the thickness of the wall and the height of the wall, should give you an idea that it wasn't really a regular place, but it was a fortress. It was an old, retired fortress, a fortress that was built in 1780. And then when planes were invented, obviously fortresses lost their value because all you do is you fly over them and drop a couple of bombs, so it's curtains. So the military moved out. And about 2,900 people lived there. And when the Nazis occupied Czechoslovakia in 1939, they said, hey, great place for a concentration camp. And so they converted it into one of the thousands of concentration camps that they had. And this is the way the place looked. It was old and dilapidated. And instead of the 3,000 people there were about something like 60,000 people. In other words, 30 times more than there were before. So this is where we slept and this is where we washed ourselves. And this is how people arrived. Except that they didn't arrive like this until I came. I helped lay these railroad tracks. I worked in the mud outside the fortress and cut willow bushes and then made big baskets for carrying potatoes or turnips or something else. I also exterminated vermin in these buildings by taping up the windows and then opening cans of cyclone gas. Put on a gas mask. This was cyanide, and then slammed the door shut, came back the next day, aired the place. The Nazis tried to use this gas for killing people, but it was much, much too slow, so their chemists got to work and they developed a much faster gas specifically for people. This was a standard gas, but they developed a gas for people. And anyway, I was there for 10 months, and one little comment about Terezín is that it was used as an exhibition camp, really, to prove to the Swiss authorities and the Swedish authorities that the Germans treated Jewish prisoners like prisoners of war, which they had to according to the Geneva Convention. So obviously there were two problems. Number one, they were overcrowded, and number two, the food was lousy. So they solved both problems very nicely. When they knew when an inspection came, they simply improved the food. Suddenly there was reasonably good food there. The problem was with the overcrowding, but they solved that too by simply putting people on trains, shipping them to Auschwitz and sending them to the gas chambers. To give you, to sum it all up, 141,000 people were sent to Terezín and 17,000 survived. Anyway, one day they brought in a whole bunch of railroad cars just like this, and they loaded us up, 100 people per car. These were cattle cars, and they closed the windows and doors, and they shipped us with a bucket inside, one bucket to be used by 100 people as a toilet, and they shipped us east. And when they opened the door after 3 days, there were a bunch of SS men and a bunch of guys in striped uniforms. And if you look at the picture carefully, every one of them has a walking stick, and they were beating us with these sticks over the heads and the faces and wherever the people were lying on the ground, crying and screaming and bleeding. And the SS had the standard SS man cap, and instead of on the lapel having the 2 arrows, SS arrows, they had a skull and crossbone. These were special SS men called Sonderkommando who worked in the camp. And when we looked behind us, there was a gate, and underneath us was mud, and next to us was electrically charged barbed wire. So we asked, where are we? And they told us, you're in Auschwitz II or Birkenau. And we never heard about it. We didn't have the slightest idea where we were. And this is the way Auschwitz looked. There was Auschwitz I, which was basically, Auschwitz I was a camp where prisoners from penitentiaries, rapists, murderers, child molesters, and so on, people who spent already maybe 10, 20 years in the penitentiary were sent to, and they acted as guards in Auschwitz II and Auschwitz III. Auschwitz III was a small factory and which made synthetic rubber, and Auschwitz II was the camp that had the gas chambers and killed and also the ovens. Everybody arrived at the green spot at the bottom, and that's where the railroad tracks were, and then people were sorted out at the railroad tracks and sent to the red spots over on the left-hand side. And the black spot in between, that's where the clothing and all the property of the people went who were sent to the camp. By the way, by the time Auschwitz finished, maybe less than a year later, 1,100,000 people had been murdered in Auschwitz. The area above the green spot were 6 different camps, each of them about 5,000 people, that were used for special purposes. While I was there, one camp was strictly for Jehovah's Witnesses and another camp was for gypsies, and both camps were completely wiped out. The area below the green spot was the women's camp, and that's where Anne Frank and her sister were, and including her mother and one of the other ladies, were brought in, and that's where they spent some time. The Auschwitz was never ever, the gas chambers were never ever bombed, although Auschwitz III was bombed, and the flying time between Auschwitz III and Auschwitz I was 1 minute. Not one single bomb ever fell on the railroad tracks, on the gas chambers, or on the German barracks. This is the way the camp looked. This is the way we looked, and we had a triangle and a number. And depending why you were there, the triangle showed the color. For instance, political prisoners were red, gay people pink, Jehovah's Witnesses purple, gypsies black, Jews yellow, and thieves and murderers were light and dark green. We also got a tattoo on our arms. And this is the way the women looked. And this is a typical barrack in which we stayed. There were 6 people on each level, and sometimes the top level would fall onto the middle on the lower level, and kill people at the lower level. There was a constant drizzle of urine and feces from one level to the other. This is a women's camp after liberation. There were only half the people there, because the other half left on a death march. This is a men's barrack after liberation, and again, this is a men's barrack after liberation. The man in the middle has the only 2 properties that we had. We had no combs, we had no pencils, we had no paper, we had absolutely nothing. The only thing we had was a bowl and a spoon, and the bowl was filled in the morning with some brown water made out of acorns, and we got a slice of bread made out of flour and sawdust. For lunch we got a soup which was really salt water, into which tiny little pieces, really tiny little pieces of dirty unwashed potatoes were cut. And in the evening we got the same type of a soup and another piece of bread. Altogether roughly 400 calories a day. Sometimes we got little pieces of turnips and sometimes nettles. The food gave us, because we had no vitamins, we lost our teeth, and we also got diarrhea, and there was constant mud, and this was the toilet that we had to use. There was no toilet paper there. This is a bench they used to punish us. For instance, if you didn't stand in line properly, then you would say 5 strokes or 10 strokes, whatever. You got sentenced, and immediately the sentence was executed. You put your feet into the 2 holes in the bottom, and then you leaned over the bench, just like this demonstration to General Eisenhower shows. One criminal held you by the arms, and the other one beat you with a stick over the spine. I've seen people dying on this. I once got 15 strokes, and I'm still amazed that I survived this. This is a typical view of the barracks at the time, not today. I think they have beautiful green lawns and so on. There was mud and dirt between the barracks, and we had to stand there 3 times a day and be counted, and if 1 person out of 5,000 was missing, we had to do all different types of what the Nazis jokingly referred to as sport. We had to do sport, which meant you had to do knee bends or push-ups or do leapfrog jumping, and you did that until a few people were dead. There was no way you could escape from the camp. There was electrically charged barbed wire, there were guard towers, there were German shepherds that had been trained to run after prisoners and tear them apart. And once a prisoner managed to escape, he was usually caught within an hour or so, sometimes 2-3 hours, when you had to stand there until they were found. Then they were brought back with big cardboard signs around their neck. It says, "Hooray, hooray, I'm back again." Only 2 men actually managed to escape the camp. They were 2 from Czechoslovakia, Rudolf Werner and Alfred Wetzler. And they managed to escape, and they got in contact with the Swiss Refugee Commission, and they begged them to bomb the camp, and nobody ever bombed it. There were some people who said, no way bomb the camp, somebody might get hurt. There were constantly people committing suicide. Every single day the power was turned off, and for maybe half an hour the bodies were removed, and then the whole thing started again. This is one of the 4 crematoria and this is a typical gas chamber into which people were jammed with their arms raised high. Little children were thrown on top of them, doors slammed shut, and through this hole in the ceiling, the Cyclone B gas, the pellets were dropped in. And once they were dead, then a special group of prisoners who had to do this job for 6 months, and after 6 months they too were sent to the gas chambers. And they went in and they removed the bodies, removed dental gold, removed any jewelry, and burnt the bodies either in these ovens or in these pits. And the only thing that remained of them were boxes full of wedding rings, piles of glasses, shoes, clothing, empty suitcases. And this is what we saw every single day. People ask me sometimes, what's the worst thing that ever happened to you? The worst thing that happened to me was that I was 16 years old and I didn't have the slightest idea whether I'm going to be alive the next day. The air was constantly filled with little flakes from the bodies, the smell of little flakes of soot. There was a smell of burning hair, and we could also hear people screaming and yelling as they were driven to the gas chambers, because these were people who already spent some time in the camp. The people who came at that time mostly were Hungarian Jews. They didn't have the slightest idea what was going on. But those of us who were there already for quite a while, we knew what was happening. One day Dr. Mengele came into the camp. Dr. Mengele was a German officer, doctor who had a PhD in anthropology and an MD in medicine. I mean, a highly educated man who performed bizarre experiments on prisoners, primarily on dwarfs and on twins. And he was affectionately known also as the Angel of Death, because he liked to select people for the gas chamber. He liked to play God. And so he came in the back at camp with a whole group of SS men, and they were standing there and telling jokes, and all the young people in the camp, those of us who were between the ages of 12 and 18, we had to strip naked and we had to run past the SS men. And there was Dr. Mengele, and occasionally he looked at us and he turned a finger or head, and somebody went to the other side. And when he was finished, there were roughly 300 of us standing there. And then he repeated the same procedure. There were 200, and eventually there were 87 or 89 of us. And we went to an adjacent camp, and that was that had the camp gallows in the backyard. This event happened on July 6, 1944. By the way, of the 89 who were saved that day, 47 survived the camps. And all the remaining 5,000 prisoners in the camp over the next 5 days were sent to the gas chamber. As I said, this was July 6, 1944, and on August 4th, 1944, roughly a month later, Anne Frank was arrested, and her family. That's the last scene that you saw. And she was sent to Westerbork, which was a collection camp, a transit camp in Holland. And then she was sent to Auschwitz about a month later, September 3rd. She arrived in Auschwitz. By that time, I was working in Auschwitz I, where the criminals were. I was working in the stables, taking care of horses. About a month after Anne arrived, she was sent to Bergen-Belsen in Germany, which was at that time still strictly a women's camp. Afterwards, men were dumped in when the Russians advanced and the concentration camp in the East Europe were emptied. And that's where Anne Frank ended up, Anne Frank and her sister. And I worked in these stables, and in January 1945, all the German criminals were put into German uniforms and sent to the Russian front. And 60,000 of us were given a piece of bread, and we started on a death march. And that was January 18th in 1945. The camp was liberated January 27th. Every time I hear January 27th and people celebrating the liberation of Auschwitz, I get mad, because I was taken away from that. And on this death march, I was not alone. As I said, there were 60,000 other people, and one of the 60,000 was Peter van Pels. He was on the same death march with me. And we walked through mud, and we walked through snow and ice, and anybody who sat down usually froze to the ground, or if they still moved, they were shot. And this continued for 3 days. And on the third day, we found ourselves at a railroad siding, and we had walked 35 miles, and of the 60,000, 50,000 had died by this time. And we thought, this is it. You know, now we are going to be somewhere where it's warm, because this was the coldest winter in the 20th century. The temperatures were always below zero, always. And instead we were loaded into open railroad cars, coal cars with a steel floor on the bottom. And we were guarded by young kids, 14-year-old kids with guns, because by this time all the soldiers were at the Russian front trying to defend the country. At one station in Moravska Ostrova, there was a railroad engine standing on the adjacent tracks, and there was a man standing next to it, and I gave him my ball and I asked him to fill it with some of the steam that had condensed, that was dripping from the engine, and he gave me a little bit. It was the first water I had in about 5 days, and was the first warm liquid I had, and still today I think it was the best food I ever had in my entire life. And then we traveled for 4 days down to Austria, and we ended up in a camp called Mauthausen, which was a concentration camp from hell. Peter van Pels was with me, went all the way to Mauthausen. Of the 60,000 that started that trip, maybe 20,000 survived until we came to Mauthausen. Those of us who could still walk, we managed to. My battery is running low. There shouldn't be any. Isn't there any power here? What? Yeah. I'm sorry. I gave you my... Yeah. Ah. To the rescue. Ta-da. Thank you. Fabulous. How do I get this? That's all wonderful things. Nothing like science. Anyway, we limped, those of us who were still alive, we limped through this gate and came into this yard and were sent to into one of these buildings, and we were showered. And we collapsed screaming with pain because all of us were frostbitten. Some people died on the spot right there and then. And underneath was mud, and after 3 days my feet started to rot. And there was a Serbian doctor there who cut off my toes on one foot and part of the toes on the other foot, bandaged it up with paper, and that's how he saved my life. And then things got really bad because we got squeezed between Russian forces and American forces, and the SS abandoned the camp. This was a very typical situation in many camps. Bergen-Belsen, where Anne Frank went to, is another typical example where they simply abandoned the camps, no food, and locked up the people, and then the camp just deteriorated completely. There were thousands of bodies all over. In the meantime, British and Canadian forces were advancing on Bergen-Belsen, and on April 15th they liberated the camp, and the camp was overrun with lice and typhus and terrible starvation. They tried to feed some of the prisoners with intravenously, but they screamed and objected terribly because they were afraid that they're going to be injected with gasoline, which was a typical method that the SS had used before on killing people. This is a scene in Bergen-Belsen. These are some of the survivors. This is the way the survivors looked. And somewhere amongst these bodies are the bodies of Anne Frank and Margaret Frank. And on May 5th, our camp was liberated, and this is the way we looked. I was at that time 17 years old, and I weighed 64 pounds, probably amongst... and then they gave us American military food. And we ate that food, and about 20,000 people died. And then they brought in the local population, they picked up the bodies and they buried them in a mass grave somewhere along one of these bodies is Peter Van Pels. I got a little piece of paper, which I still have today, and I hitchhiked back to Yugoslavia. And when I came back to Yugoslavia, there was no family there. There were no friends there, and there was communism there, which was just as bad as the fascists, only they were killing different people. But they were actually killing. There were maybe 2-minute trials, 10-minute trials. That's my document from being in Yugoslavia. And then from there on, I went to England. And when I came to England, I had no skills, I had no education, I couldn't speak English. So I started working as a laborer, then as a machine tool fitter, then as a tool and die maker. I got married and I came to the States. And I was amongst the poor and tired masses. And I still remember very well as the boat moved in and suddenly the Statue of Liberty was above me. So what happened to all the people in the attic? There were only really two survivors. One of them was Otto Frank, who died in Switzerland at the age of 91, and the other one was Miep Gies. She died in 210 at the age of 101. And Anne Frank is remembered by this simple document in Bergen-Belsen and by this diary. As you've heard, Anne recorded many things in it. And here's just one of the pages. She wrote about a whole range of subjects, but it's probably best remembered by a simple observation. How wonderful it is that nobody needs to wait a single second before starting to improve the world. What a beautiful thought and so easy to follow. So why don't we all try it? It will truly make this world a better place. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much for giving us your time to show you the diary of Anne Frank. Thank you.